The cultural thing is striking. So cybersecurity failures in these high hazard industries are often less about unknown unknowns, more about known issues that weren't acted on.
Once people lose that shared understanding of what's going on, decision making starts to diverge, communication fragments, leadership starts to look ineffective.
April 26 marks the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. It remains the worst nuclear accident in history. The causes weren't cyber. There was no malware, no nation-state attacker, no zero-day exploit lurking in the control systems.
So you may be wondering why we're talking about it on this podcast. Because when you strip it back, Chernobyl wasn't just a technical failure. It was a failure of leadership, communication, culture, and how humans behave under pressure. In this episode, we're looking at a paper that compares Chernobyl with Fukushima, another level 7 nuclear disaster, the highest the international nuclear and radiological event scale goes. And we explore what happens when crisis hits and the people in charge have to make decisions in real time. Because whether it's a nuclear reactor or a SOC, patterns start to look very familiar. Delayed escalation, poor communication, over-reliance on process when the situation no longer fits the playbook, and teams trying to do the right thing in conditions where the information is incomplete, conflicting, or just plain wrong.
Joining us in this special episode to unpack this, we've got two brilliant guests. First guest is an academic working in the field of cybersecurity and forensics, with a focus on functional safety and industrial control systems and a wealth of expertise in nuclear facilities. And the other specializes in the psychology of cybersecurity teams, how people think, react, and make decisions when everything's on fire. And in this case, sometimes literally.
Chernobyl and Fukushima were accidents, but they give us something rare, a real-world view of what happens when these systems start to fail, how people respond, how decisions get made, and how quickly things can escalate. Because today, failure isn't the only risk. There are entirely new ways to trigger it.
So today, Jeff, we're looking at a paper called A Look at Leadership Management of Chernobyl and Fukushima Nuclear Accidents by Dunman and Oze. And I'm really sorry, both of those authors, if I've got it wrong. But the links, as always, will be in the show notes so you can read it yourself. And it's a paper from 2025. So the paper asked the question, what if the biggest nuclear disasters in history weren't just caused by broken systems, but by the people in charge? And this paper takes two nuclear crises, decades apart, very different contexts, but what it shows some surprising similarities with the leadership failures. One's shaped by secrecy, which is the Chernobyl one with rigid Soviet hierarchy, and the other by the Fukushima disaster, bureaucracy, and overconfidence in safety systems.
It's really interesting that both show the same kind of patterns: slow decisions, poor communication, and a reluctance to fully confront what was actually happening.
So this paper argues something quite uncomfortable, and that is that in high-stake crisis, when things are literally melting down, it's not enough to have procedures or even expertise. This paper suggests that what really matters is whether leaders can adapt, can they communicate honestly, and can they act fast when under pressure. And spoiler alert for this paper, more often than not, they don't. So we're going to be unpacking what went wrong with this kind of leadership and what actually works and why organizations keep getting this so catastrophically wrong. We were looking at this paper obviously through the lens of cybersecurity and what we can learn from there. So Jeff, what did you think of this paper?
It was a very interesting study on the styles of leadership, and while it doesn't go too deeply into the incidents themselves, it shows that there are a lot of parallels. It also calls out the need for things like training and preparedness, but also the main thing is looking at how organizational culture shapes leadership effectiveness, and it's more than you'd imagine. I thought that was really powerful, and as we were both reading it, I think it became clear that there were some transferable lessons between people might think, well, I don't work in a nuclear power plant, that's ridiculous. Quite a lot of people do work in things like the financial services, in healthcare, other places where actually safety, availability, the kind of confidentiality, the integrity of data is becoming a safety issue. It is critical that we get these things right. So the lessons learned from not only from these disasters, but also from the actual industries themselves and how they've evolved, which you'll hear from our guests as well, are very transferable to the rest of the industry. If anything, by now they should be better prepared than anybody else. So that what do? You learn from the better prepared people, because you might not be a nuclear power plant, but I imagine you can learn something from how they now work.
Yeah, so we picked this paper just because the Chernobyl anniversary is happening. But that's not to say that nuclear power plants are the only kind of big infrastructure problems that can go wrong. Obviously, nobody wants a nation-state actor coming in and hacking into the system of a nuclear power plant and doing absolute awful damage. But there is other huge forms of national infrastructure that we do want to protect. And I can imagine that applying the same principles of what happened in terms of the leadership styles at Chernobyl and Fukushima Fukushima. If you took those leaders and put them in another industry, there was the water hack that happened, things like that. Things are going to hit the fan just as bad there if a nation state gets in. So I think it was really interesting. What I thought was interesting is the paper describes that there's 3 types of leadership. There's transformational leadership, which they don't go into too much detail about what that kind of means. Reading between the lines, it's basically being a leader that's able to respond to new and emerging challenges in a kind of very flexible way. The other one was transactional leadership, which is the subordinate superior relationship with employees. They suggest that the person who's a transactional leader is a person who avoids risks and leads and guides communications. They have a strong emphasis on protocols, rules, and predefined roles. And then the other type of leadership they discuss is complexity leadership. This style of leadership focuses on adaptability, emergent problem solving, and is able to manage crises more effectively and have more timely decision making, and prioritizes transparent and clear communication. And also, crucially, for complexity leadership, they say that it really helps with international collaboration, which is really important because when a cyber incident happens, it's not just the cybersecurity team dealing with it. You have to work with loads of other departments to kind of get things back online and where you need to be and back up and running and safe again. So I think the suggestion is that the complexity leadership is a preferred leadership style.
But I think just over the discussions we have with the guests, especially the second part with Bec, I think she does point out that all of them have their place, because sometimes you do want somebody to go by the book and sometimes things do have to go in a very structured way. But it's important to be able to use the different styles in your organization and recognize when to also provide things like autonomy. And we also discussed the fact that although obviously a meltdown is a big ticket item, it's a thing that everybody remembers, the effect on a country of a disruption to any of these critical national infrastructure items. We had attacks against things like Transport for London. If suddenly nobody in London can get on the tubes, actually that costs a nation billions maybe. There's a huge impact to the disruption of national infrastructure attacks that go beyond the kind of movie level items, where things start exploding. Just not having power in a country can be ruinous. So it's actually really important that we understand that the safety of a nation doesn't just begin and end, I think, with whether or not we're in a nuclear winter. It actually starts on can we actually self-sustain as a nation as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where this paper also becomes useful is recognizing that there is stages in a crisis happening. And as you say, Bec goes into this a lot more as well in the second half of this episode. There is a time and place for every leadership style, but in their table which they provide, they suggest sort of like the initial response. You need a transactional leadership, but it's not full on transactional. So it's not just a manager backing orders that you're saying you need to do. You need some of that because you need some structure to be able to deal with the initial response. But then it does go on to say that it does require some levels of flexibility there.
But I think that might actually be culturally contextual, because in some cultures, hierarchy and more traditional structures may still persist. I imagine in some organizations, it still persists.
So they also say at the communication level, transformational leadership is critical for maintaining public trust and building up transparency. Obviously, in the Chernobyl incident, they didn't actually let the international community know for at least 3 days. And, well, they didn't even really let their own people know for even longer than that, and downplayed the risks. And as a result, Gorbachev cites the handling of the Chernobyl incident as his turning point to really get in his glasnost perestroika changes in to really change the Soviet Union, which eventually obviously led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. They recognized that the way they communicated in that very hierarchical kind of secrecy and almost misinformation style actually delayed their ability to respond to the incident, and had not just short-term effects of perhaps the response led to more people losing their lives than they needed to, but also, as I say, the fall of the Soviet Union in general is sometimes cited with this incident.
On the other side, the Fukushima incident does call out that there's an over-reliance on believing that certain safety systems were completely foolproof. It kind of lacks almost like an empirical view on things of actually this isn't working. Despite, you can say that something's impenetrable, you can say that something is absolutely foolproof, but when the evidence is telling you otherwise, you need that ability to adapt very quickly to figure out what is your next plan, what is the next fallback, because you need more than one plan in this kind of incident, especially when you can see that the fail-safes are actually not failing safe.
And as I say, we'll go into this more, listeners. A lot of it is down to the culture of the organization itself. You can't go around saying you would quite like to have transformational complexity leadership, which is cited in this paper as the preferable leadership styles when dealing with crises, if you're not in a company that allows you to question things and challenge ideas and embrace embraces transparency. It just doesn't work unless that cultural backing is there from the organization, which I think is quite key and obviously was very much linked to why the Chernobyl incident, why the Fukushima incident, as nuclear incidents, not cyber incidents, but as nuclear incidents were unsuccessful. I think there's a lot to learn from this paper. But what I would say is this paper is very, very brief, and it's just as a starting point for this episode.
So before we get to the leadership discussion, Oleg is going to take us through how feasible it is that a nuclear power plant might be susceptible to some kind of cyber attack.
Scary stuff.
Oleg, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Leanne. So I'm Oleg Illiashenko, currently holding a position of senior lecturer in cybersecurity and digital forensics at Bec University. Originally, I'm from Ukraine, city Kharkiv, and I graduated from National Space University and has a PhD in computer engineering and cybersecurity. So working in incident response, system security, web and network, and I have pretty much big experience in cybersecurity and safety co-engineering, particularly in nuclear power plants energy domain.
And what a treat for our listeners to have you on, Oleg. Very, very exciting. Can't wait to pick your brains about not only the Chernobyl incident, but I guess more pertinent, what's going on in the world of cybersecurity with our current nuclear facilities. So the first question I have for you is, when people hear nuclear risks, they obviously immediately think of things like explosions and meltdowns, so Chernobyl, Fukushima. But from your perspective, working as an academic in the cybersecurity field, what does risk actually look like in nuclear facilities today?
When the people, the general audience, when they think or hear about the nuclear risk, they often picture like explosives, force, like big damages, environmental disruption, hazardous conditions. In the modern nuclear operations, as we can see, risk is usually better described as several component factors, like first, loss of control over safety margins and safety controls, loss of reliable information needed for the time-critical decisions, which is very important if the incidents occur, and the loss of assured shutdowns and cooling, which is particularly inevitable for nuclear power plants, whether caused by accident, by human organization failure, or by malicious acts. So risk is like a battle for reliable instrumentation, in-time decisions, and proper incident response.
So I guess there's a follow-on question to that, is thinking about some of the scenarios that could happen from a cybersecurity point of view when it comes to nuclear facilities. And I imagine there'll be things like, nation-state attacks, as there was things like Stuxnet and things like that. But what are some of the most credible disaster-level cyber scenarios?
Yeah, in safety terms, the worst credible scenario could be one that defeats multiple layers of defense in depth without requiring science fiction. So the most credible high consequence or high drastically consequent cyber scenario is not the instant meltdown, but the coordinated degradation of monitoring, control, and recovery during the plant transit, especially if combined with stresses like grid instability, maintenance outages like it was in Fukushima, and or stuffing and environmental destruction like it was in Chernobyl. So we can describe it publicly without giving adversaries a playbook, is when, for example, the first step is when adversary gains durable access to parts of the supporting digital ecosystem, which is obviously installed near the nuclear power plant, like engineer workstations, data archive historians, maintenance tooling, or some plan of support network. Then they aim for integrity attacks, false or delayed information, which will drastically influence the decision-making procedures, and availability attacks, for example, like denying of access to key systems, and the operator workload saturation, rather than simply shutting everything down because it's impossible. But in most severe cases, which is still credible, the cyber capabilities could be used to degrade safety-related decision support and emergency preparedness. So thus increasing the probability that the otherwise manageable event will be escalated.
That sounds incredibly scary stuff. Jeff touched upon just then the famous Stuxnet incident in 2010. For our listeners that are not familiar with it, I believe it's the first known attack to physically impact physical infrastructure. So a highly sophisticated computer worm targeted the supervisory control and data acquisition systems in Iran's nuclear program, and it affected the centrifuges for uranium enrichment. I believe it manipulated the speeds and things like that, and obviously that's incredibly scary. But when you think of incidents like that, are we seeing anything? So that's 2010. Have we learned anything from those lessons from a cybersecurity perspective about how to reinforce our defenses against such an attack?
Yeah, the thing with the Stuxnet, which was discovered in 2010, yeah, it's correct. This is the first well-known or widely spread information about the attack of sabotage, malware, things in the Middle East. But it is not only one which should be named here in this section. We can talk about Triton and Crisis on the Middle East as well, where there were attack on safety shutdown controllers. We shouldn't forget about Ukraine power grid attacks in 2015 or industrial malware in 2016, 2017 as well. Or, for example, like KHNP in South Korea, where the data leak included employee records, mostly impacting confidentiality. And with the Sellafield cybersecurity offenses, where the regulated prosecution and prosecuted fined for cybersecurity shortfalls, despite having the evidences, not the fact, the evidences that the state actor hacking is described by media. So if we're talking about all of these incidents, all of these attacks, if we talk about Fukushima, the independent commission, they tried to tie the root cause to governance and culture. And the Chernobyl side, the international, let's say, the publicly available information, it updated deficiencies on the broader safety and regulatory framework and explicitly stated that the safety culture has not been properly instilled and enforced, and thus the human factor influenced the thing. So translating that into cybersecurity, silencing weak signals. When the engineers see insecure remote access, they didn't believe that can raise some bad consequences, but it happened. The bureaucratic and the cultural implications of both Soviet culture and that nomenclature, that government, and Japanese culture of not in-time disclosure, the things influence the environment, obviously. So security by policy and security by reality, which actually mostly on paper, and when the audit looks fine, but day-to-day workarounds, they accumulate, and we need somehow tackle with them. And yeah, this is mostly about the organizational boundary wars. So the modern literature and the sources, they describe conflicting priorities between IT security personnel and control OT, systems engineering operation, and how the lack collaboration can influence the probability of risk. So, even despite the fact that the technical reports of International Electrotechnical Committee and the standardization bodies, they're currently working on the development of the secure framework and secure environment, there is a still very big, not misunderstanding, but miscommunication between IT guys and OT guys. And these are the things that we need to mention and to properly address.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, isn't it? I guess, think back to Chernobyl days. Really, computers still existed, obviously, but certainly the internet was not as widespread because certainly the web did not exist. Things weren't necessarily internet connected. And I guess I would imagine, so I don't know this, and you can feel free to correct me here, that modern nuclear facilities are far more digital, automated, interconnected. And I guess there's more IoT as well. And I've seen in the past we've discussed this on the podcast and from our own research, that IoT is a kind of a hotbed of vulnerabilities.
Well, I would like to just quickly slide in and just quickly ask, just for my own sanity. I heard somewhere, and I think it might be a rumor, but I heard somewhere that there's a mix between it's all getting very interconnected, but also there's a good chunk of it that still runs on floppy disks because it's seen as the safest way forward. So if you could also put that rumor to bed as well, as well as answering Jeff's question.
Yeah, I guess the question was, does now they're more interconnected, does this make them safer, or does it make them more complex? Does it add to the complexity on the surface and make it more fragile?
Okay, the thing is that the short answer is both. They are more safer, but they are more fragile because they are more complex and interdependent. Because the most safe and most reliable tool can be, for example, hammer. Yeah, you can do the job with a hammer. It's easy to fix and it can do the job. You cannot compromise it. It either exists or not. When we're talking about the complex digital systems, the digitalization can increase safety through better diagnostics, through automation of routine tasks, and, for example, using AI as well, improving validation like alarm or the noises, or improving better monitoring. but if and only if they're engineered with safety insurance and strong cyber governance. We can rely on Nuclear Energy Agency for Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and their consensus position explicitly warning that cybersecurity features must be evaluated so they do not compromise safety functions, operability, or reliability. And it should stress the careful justification when security features add additional complexity in new failure modes. Because when we're talking about the safety, we need to understand that all the safety features needs to be validated, needs to be verified, justified, measured, traced. And before launching the facility into the fully operation mode, the guys from the National Regulatory Committee or another sort of state organization, they need to check if all the safety controls are not only put in place, but how they implemented. Cybersecurity guys and cybersecurity world often tries to make the things a little bit complex to disclose, like introduction encryption or zones or
cybersecurity making it
layers.
difficult for people, making it complex. I don't believe that.
Cybersecurity add complexity, which can influence safety. This is the short answer. And here it should be the bounded complexity with assurance of safe state behavior. So this is the thing. There should be always compromise. And when we're talking about the nuclear power plants, we need to consider not only the integrity of data, availability of information, and if the state-funded actors or other highly funded actors or activists try to disrupt the services, the availability of information for the diagnostics could be more important than the confidentiality, for example, because the event has already happened, everyone knows about it, but we need to save the controls of the operation, being the good team, being the blue team. So this is like the very tricky part between the interplay, what we would like to disclose, what we can disclose, and if the event already happened, if the drastic event already occurred, can we say, yes, this is our fault, but we are in full control over it?
And you mentioned this just now. How much of the current threats that we're seeing at nuclear facilities today are nation-state driven, do you think? What proportion of it?
Without going deep into the conspiracy things, the short and precise answer can be that nation-states, they dominate worst-case sabotage risk. And everyone contributes to the day-to-day attack surface. So I cannot provide you the percentage because really I didn't know it, and I tried to base all my answers basically publicly available data. But if the threat is sabotage with the potential safety consequences, then the actor class most plausibly capable and historically evidenced in nation state or state backed, because they typically require lots of resources, lots of investigations prior to the attack, accesses, social engineering, and patience over the years, and the payoffs is strategic rather than financial. Going back to the Stuxnet, which is the exemplifying case of state-level capability causing the physical damage in nuclear context. And the US government and partners have publicly attributed and charged state actors for energy sector intrusions and safety systems targeting other industries, like, for example, the influence of Russian hackers. But if the threat is not sabotage, but data theft, disruption of services, then the criminals and hacktivists are much more prominent, and their actions can still become safety relevant indirectly, like loss of availability, loss of trust, loss of state focus, compromised communications, like different spectre factors. Hacktivists, criminals, states, terrorists, and the accidental incidents like vulnerabilities disclosure, missing patches, disruption of supply chains are very significant right now.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, and maybe this is just being me. This is me being quite naive. But if you attack a nuclear facility, surely we all lose if something goes disastrously wrong. Environmental damage and everything, really. And so it seems strange to me that even a very capable nation state would want to do that, or even a terrorist would want to do that, because the knock-on effect on the surrounding area and things like that would be just too great. So I guess what you said just at the end there, you were kind of indicating actually the risk isn't a lot of nation states aiming to bring down nuclear facilities, because obviously that would be quite disastrous for everyone involved, including the people doing it. But it's actually, there's a big build-up of lots of workarounds, maybe lots of poor practices that all accumulate to a cybersecurity threat that can just happen accidentally, as if you would, for example, in retail, see a cybersecurity incident just because they've not taken the time to harden their systems in a way that's adequate, and though it's led to more opportunistic cybersecurity incidents. Would you say that's kind of the case?
Yeah. I think you're the right point. For example, referring to the Ukraine's grid attacks as the nuclear supporting infrastructure warnings and supply chains and the interconnected facilities with nuclear power plants. In 2015, the Ukraine power grid cyber attack is documented as the first publicly available or publicly, let's say, acknowledged cyber incident to cause a power outage. And the reports, the publicly available information describes coordinated intrusion, remote operation of SCADA systems, and actions like malicious firmware on field communication devices. But for nuclear operations, the key takeaway is not that the reactor was hacked, but how grid instability can be induced and how operator response can be obstructed. And across regions like Europe, US, UK, Asia, maybe one NPP in Africa, best practices, they converge a few pillars: governance, segmentation in zones, conduits, secure engineer lifecycle, and supply chain control, which nowadays can be disrupted by different state actors, instant response, and the culture. And the difference between different cases in different countries are in how prescriptive regulation is and how mature implementation has become over the years, over the last decades.
So one thing to sort of also to focus on the positive side of what the nuclear industry has been doing in the cyber field. I guess, what are some of the great, I guess not so much innovations, but the things that have been put in place? Obviously, it's very highly safety critical and really important. What are some of the good practices, do you think? Some of the things that actually the wider cybersecurity community and discipline could learn from, certainly your experience of how this has been implemented across the world?
The good thing which can be taken from the nuclear world, from energy world to other OT industrial related systems can be the strong need on the independent verification and validation, the defense in depth mechanisms and securing of zones, distributing of the between control room and the shutdown things, and the multi-layer decision making. So, for example, we can say that AI can be used for predictive maintenance or conditional-based maintenance, applying the machine learning to equipment performance data like temperature, pressure, flow, vibration to predict failures, anomaly detection, fusing multivariate signals to detect abnormal situations and disruptions between the normal state and fail-safe state, supporting of decision-making of operators where the AI can add another decision making, not fully autonomy, which is very important, where models can help to triage the weak signals, alarms, and propose some hypotheses, but the human is still making the decision. And robotics and inspection, for example, where AI enhanced like computer vision or navigation can help us to send robots, not real people, to execute very dangerous things and inspections in areas where it's difficult to access or where not always explicitly like documented or disclosed to the public, just to save the human life.
So there's a lot to go at there. I guess one question I have for you, and again, it's a bit reductive. How likely would it most of the common vectors into most organizations is via phishing. How likely would a phishing attack be able to have a really detrimental effect on a nuclear facility?
I don't think that the phishing attack, to be honest, is possible. One of the phishing is a good example of the social engineering attacks. But to be honest, I don't think it's possible because the control rooms and the equipment, which actually regulates the safety functions, thanks to God, is not connected to the internet still. And this is one major, let's say, good thing. Okay, so the decision making whether to stop the reaction or whether to change the operational to fail-safe state cannot be influenced externally via the internet access. And this is a good thing because of the segmentation. But actually, as the practice of, not my practice, but the practice of inspection, the complex IoT systems or SCADA systems in, for example, ICT or in automation control, like in other plants, there are lots of possibilities of man-in-the-middle attack and the insider threat attack. But phishing, I don't think it's really the case, to be honest. More important is the interconnection between different types of attacks. Of course, starting from the invigilation, from investigations, social engineering, then acquiring some information by the activists, by the hackers, not by the hackers from the personnel, and then manipulating that information, bringing like some type of devices into the nuclear facility, plugging those devices directly into the control environment, which can possibly stop them. But as far as we know, there are lots of checks and safety mechanisms to prevent these type of degrading of the system.
Well, at least people in nuclear facilities can take heed that if they fail the phishing simulation test at work, be okay anyway, as it won't bring down the plant. But there's a good advice there, network segregation. So I think we should just all turn our work emails off, and we'd be better off without them, and be safer, more productive individuals for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember we were at B-Sides Leeds a couple of years ago, maybe it was last year, and they were talking about it was I think manufacturing, where they had an IT network and an OT network, and of course the two had good separation, so you can't have a network traversal, except that they were wrong. So they got in and they managed to control one of the production line arms, and they went, "Oh, we shouldn't be doing this," and they quickly stopped it and then said, "We've found a really bad flaw in your network segregation." And that's that might be the kind of thing. It just takes one bridge, like people getting into systems where you've got incredible security, really good device management, and somebody plugs an unpatched, unsecured printer into the network, and you go, whoops. I guess that keeps people up at night, and that kind of makes me think, like, what keeps you up at night from your from your research and from what you know about the industry? What isn't getting enough attention in the field?
Among the things that can keep me up at night that is not getting enough attention right now could be the under-discussed issues, which are globally relevant to all countries. The first and foremost, and I already pointed this out, is the supply chain and servicing reality. Because right now, the facility which actually operates in a particular country, it cannot be self-sustained, self-sufficient enough in terms of modernization, in terms of replacement of the obsolete and legacy systems, in terms of software patches, in terms of the chips and hardware which is used there. So here, the red flags are very big and more complex, because supply chains disruptions, external tools, reliance, the reliance on contractor vendor activities can affect safety capability and cybersecurity simultaneously. Because as we can see right now, we're living in the world of constant change, let's put it in that way, of the geopolitical instability and disruption of the things which are produced on one part of the world and then shipped and supplied to another part of the world. And we can see how it influences our economy and the safety as well. So I think that supply chain and servicing reality is one of the most important factors here. Alongside, we need to talk about the supporting infrastructure, which is soft underbelly, especially the grid dependence and beyond design threats conditions. Talking about Ukraine, for example, it can show us how attacks on substations, which is connected to the grid, and the grid destabilization itself becomes a nuclear safety issues, even without a single PLCs being touched in the plant. And the third, maybe not the highest ranking, but anyways, is actually AI, of course, which can be both the accelerator and the new failure mode. So there is a known psychological trap. We haven't seen the worst, therefore the worst won't happen, but we'll see. I hope everything will be good.
Do you think that's why maybe we're not where we should be with cybersecurity safety in nuclear facilities, because we haven't seen a catastrophic event yet? Do you think that maybe we're a bit overconfident, or are we burying our head in the sand, just like the Soviets in Chernobyl, saying, "Hey, it's"?
I think this is both the psychological bias of the government or the part of people which actually ruled the countries. I think that international agency in IAEA in nuclear energy, they try to address this as much as possible, where the working groups, where inspections of the nuclear facilities, were raising the awareness about the impossibility of disruption of the services of that power plant. So, but talking about I cannot talk about all people of the world. I can talk about myself and my own private observations. I don't think that people are really put much attention to the things that can disrupt not only the services and the access to YouTube, Netflix, or whatsoever, but about really more important things like very obsolete and legacy-based systems, their upgrade, and the type of cybersecurity risks that are introduced inevitably via these upgrades. So, answering your question, there is a psychological bias. We will not face the things because it never happened to us. But the problem is more complex in the cognitive deviance, let's put it in this way, that people do not think about it at all.
But at least you are, in your academic capacity.
Maybe a bit of some small spice narratives corner for cybersecurity circle.
Sure.
Yeah, and addressing the previous thing about the facing the drastic consequences. In cyber physical security circles, people often circulate several narratives, like which should be treated purely as a speculation, not a verified fact. But nevertheless, the reason why we haven't seen a cyber-nuclear catastrophe is not because it's impossible. Obviously, it's possible, but because the real game is in prepositioning. So the management theory in references that were indicated in the paper that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. The theory says that major powers prefer quiet access that can be activated only in extreme crisis, because an actual nuclear release would be strategically self-defeating for everyone. So that can feed the pattern seen into critical infrastructure geopolitics, but it is not something one can claim as proven for NPP specifically without classified evidence, and we can say that. Another thing is that the safest systems are the ones no one can update until the day you must update them. So here, the conspirational twist is the idea that long life cycle and delayed update of legacy system and modernization, they create the perfect environment for hidden long-term compromise, the hardware Trojans, software Trojans in the supply chain as well. And what is verifiable here, and what we can say with a confidence, is that regulators and international bodies that treat supply chain patching and vendor activities as the real serious concerns. Yeah, and I think the last one, that the incidents happen more often than we hear because disclosure is reputationally radioactive. This is half spicy, to be honest, half documented reality, because multiple sources and multiple, even open access, publicly available information analyzes point to limited public information and reluctance to disclose cybersecurity gaps. And here the conspiracy is the leap from limited transparency exists to there must be constant cover-ups. So basically,
there's lots of, hasn't there been like 10 US nuclear workers disappeared in the last few years? Just disappeared off the face of the earth. But again, we're going conspiracy theory land, and I only got that news from Twitter. So, but so someone keeps posting on my feed like there's another nuclear scientist in America gone missing again.
Yeah, people are missing, people are disappearing all over the world, and we cannot say what was the cause of this event. And the speculation on life of people, it's a very, very bad thing. And we need to treat social media with very carefully regarding such of things, considering who publishing it, who benefit from publishing this type of information, and what can be the possible influence and the outcomes, whether it's just raising no attention or accumulating the likes or, I don't know, anything like that. So long story short, we are safe right now, we're secured, and we're believing that the future is bright. So I hope I will not put too much stress with the providing some facts on you guys today. But thanks for inviting me. It was a really nice conversation and the possibility to share my ideas and some thoughts.
And with that, thank you so much, Oleg. This has been a phenomenal discussion. I've learned so much, and I'm also a little bit scared. So thank you so much for your time. If people want to get in touch with you, is what's the best way to do so?
Yeah, it's possible to contact me. I can leave you the email, I don't know, LinkedIn, anything. What will work better? So
Great.
I'll
put your LinkedIn details in the show notes. So if you do want to pick up the conversation with Oleg, hopefully you feel free to do so. But this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. It's been absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. It's been brilliant. Oh, I really enjoyed that conversation. Certainly a very different type of guest with a very interesting set of experience and insight into an industry that I personally had very little knowledge before now. So I certainly learned a lot from it. What do you think, Leanne?
Yeah, well, I was very much in my element there. Really enjoyed that conversation there with Oleg. Really great insights. I mean, I kind of hope I never have to be in that situation. It sounds particularly scary at the moment. I think it was really interesting to hear about how important things like the supply chain is and reliance on external vendors for hardware and software and maintenance and all that jazz. It's just what you hear in other industries as well. So if something as too hot to fail, I mean, literally meltdown hot. Too hot to fail as a nuclear power plant, for example. If they still have the same issues, then does our same advice of how we secure other industries, is that still applicable? Should we be doing more, or is there not more we can do in this instance? Yeah, I thought that's what I thought was very interesting about it.
I thought it was interesting against the context of an increase in digitalization in the world and interconnection as well. And nuclear facilities are getting these kind of things as well, obviously with a big demarcation between their operational systems and their more back office systems. But it's a double-edged sword, is this level of digitalization, because it can enhance safety via better monitoring systems and things like that, but it also introduces complexity and new failure modes, and this can potentially increase system fragility. I think it's interesting that it cuts both ways.
Indeed it does. So Oleg has gone through and told us how feasible a cyber attack is on a nuclear power plant and what the consequences would be. Now we're going to come back to the paper and look at how does that impact leadership style. And we're going to do that with our second guest, Bec McKeown. So our lovely listeners will be delighted to have back a fan favourite. Some of our most listened episodes come from this lovely person, Bec McKeown. Welcome back.
Thank you. Hello.
So Bec, what have you been up to lately? So our listeners that are new to the show and our past listeners, tell us a bit about yourself.
Gosh, yeah, it's been a busy year, really. I'm a chartered psychologist by trade. I run a company called Mind Science, and I have been busying myself with building a cognitive readiness program. And it's all about human performance in high pressure situations. So there's a lot that I can bring in to the conversation that we're going to have today. Background wise, I used to work for Cranfield University, where I taught and researched in human factors. And Chernobyl was one of the case studies that we frequently use with students all those years ago. So it's something that I'm quite familiar with. And I think it's been interesting for me to go back all of those years to that sort of human factors background, but also to look at it through the new lens of all the research I've been doing more recently in how people behave in high pressure situations and why they make mistakes and why they don't always function as well as they've been trained to in situations like this. And it's all down to a skill called cognitive readiness. So you're going to hear a lot more about that throughout this episode.
That way, and knowing about your new offerings, you're right, it seems perfect for what we're going to discuss today regarding the Chernobyl incident.
I think the baseline position that I take really is that we see all of these familiar patterns in incidents, whether it's communication, delays in decision making, leadership challenges, friction between different people who have different priorities. But that is quite surface level, and the paper itself, I think, doesn't really dig into that and explain why these things break down under pressure. And that's where the whole cognitive readiness thing comes in, because we behave differently when we're under stress.
Indeed, and that's precisely why we brought you in. And I think Jeff's got the first question for you.
Sure, yeah. We've all read this paper now. And I think we all around remember when Chernobyl happened and also when Fukushima happened. How much of what went went wrong in both of these cases was really a leadership problem, and how much of it was a human behavioural problem?
That's a really difficult question because it's kind of almost impossible to pull those things apart because leaders are people.
I think we forget that, don't we?
We do. We talk about leadership and we forget that actually, primarily, we're all human beings. And it's a bit like me, really. People say, as a psychologist, is your behaviour not perfect all the time? No, because I'm a psychologist second. I'm still a human being with a brain that works in a certain way under pressure. So, I'm not fallible. She said quick excuses coming out first. And I think that the paper itself was quite interesting. It looked at communication, ownership, I'm looking at my notes here, transparency and trust, preparation, communication, decision making, but none of those things fail in isolation. So to me, what fails first is the human's ability to stay aligned under pressure. And once people lose that shared understanding of what's going on, decision making starts to diverge, communication fragments, leadership starts to look ineffective. So what we label as leadership is usually really a downstream effect of what happens with that initial loss of alignment because the brain works in a different way under pressure.
Which do you think of those sort of factors do you think often fails first? We've got communication, leadership, decision making, also all the other different factors. What kind of ones do you think typically fail first in a crisis?
It's what lies underneath it that fails first, and it's the ability to regulate emotion, because it doesn't matter how much experience you have, how much training you've had, how many times you've been through this. The first thing that happens, particularly in cybersecurity, is there's a feeling of dread. I was speaking to somebody a few weeks ago, and he said as soon as he realised exactly what was going on, this was a major breach, system was very compromised, and he just said, I had an out-of-body experience. I thought I was going to die. So whilst we were laughing about it because of his turn of phrase was quite amusing, but what he was describing was a massively physiological reaction. My stomach clenches and I'm talking about it because I felt so sorry for him. That knot in the stomach, the heart rate's going faster, panic is starting to set in because not only is I know somebody's in the system, we know that they're deeply embedded, I'm going to lose my job, because it's always the CISO's fault, isn't it, when something like this happens. So actually, but what he was describing was, like I said, a very big physiological reaction. So you've got all of those things going on. Now, when those things happen, regardless of, like I say, of all of the experience that you've got, your brain reacts in a certain way. And what happens is that the adrenaline starts flowing. And when the adrenaline goes up, sense and reason goes down because your brain is focusing in on the thing that is causing you to be under attack. So when back in caveman days and we were running away from saber-toothed tigers, that was the threat. And the adrenaline pumps to get you out of that situation. Same principle, different threat. And what happens in that situation is that your brain just focuses down on very narrow things. So you stop taking in lots of information from all over the place. You focus on the first thing that you come across and you start to problem solve based on that. So that is where the decision making fails because you've got that narrowed view. Because we're under pressure, we kind of lose our niceties. So there's no nice little explanations explaining to everybody what's going on. It's definitely very much more, it turns into a bit of a command and control sort of situation where you barking out orders or demanding information coming in. That can create friction. More friction comes because the team across the bridge itself will all be looking at it from a different perspective. So then you've got differences in opinion as to, do we take action now? Do we wait for more information? How do we interpret that information? And that causes friction. So that one little thing underneath it causes problems across the piece. And that's why I say you can't really say what failed first. Was it leadership, communication, decision making? Because they're all failing because of emotional regulation and the ability to stay calm in a crisis.
That seems to me something that would be very difficult to practice. So we talk a lot about doing tabletop exercises and doing drills and things, practicing for when something awful happens. However, can you ever really replicate that out-body experience, that sense of dread when you're doing things like that?
I would say no, because you can't experience it unless you're actually in it live, and B, ethically it'd probably be questionable if you were going to do a tabletop exercise which invoked that level of horror. It's not really about having that situation replicated. I mean, tabletop exercises are really useful because when you're in that crisis mode, to be able to react automatically and follow that playbook that you know so well because you've rehearsed it so many times is absolutely vital. And I think I've spoken to quite a few CISOs lately who've said actually that is the thing that can help calm you down. So it's a very important part of it, but you've still got that emotional reaction. And there's also a level of confidence that has to go with that, because if you're following that playbook rigidly, you might not deviate from it when the information coming in is telling you that, we need to go that way instead of this way. So there's a whole load of things going on there. Playbook is important. The sort of skills that I'm talking about with emotional regulation isn't something that you can rehearse during that moment. It's something that you need to learn about. So you learn to recognize your own triggers. You need to learn what happens to you personally when those triggers occur, and then you will know what to do about it in order to bring your system back into calm. Now, you can't really do that in a tabletop exercise situation, and you can't do it at the time of the crisis. It's something that you need to work on throughout your daily work, if you like. And this is what we do with the CRIQ, is that we have a session whereby we identify those things. We do a dysregulation heat map, if you like. So each person is aware of how they react to certain situations and the impact of that. In between the modules, they go away and they have what I call a cognitive readiness journal. And the idea is that you start to, now you're aware of those things, you start to spot when you see them in your day-to-day life. And it might well be work life, it might be home life, but it's actually learning to spot them and then thinking back on, well, actually, now I've spotted it, how am I going to spot it next time? What plan am I going to have in place to be able to react to that? And the more you do it, the more adept you get. So you start to understand. I mean, I know, for example, now when I'm driving down a motorway and there's some middle lane hogger for some reason drives me nuts. But now I know that actually it's a bit of a trigger for me. So
that's your trigger, yeah.
That's my trigger. I'm going to ignore that. I'm not going to get emotionally engaged with this problem. I'll just stay in my own lane and mind my own business, sort of thing. So it's about awareness of what your triggers are, recognizing them once you've had them. And then there's the reflection side of it is, okay, so when that thing happened the other day and I lost my mind and I got angry about something, what was it that caused that? And then the more you start to spot it and you do that reflection, then the easier it is to spot it when it actually happens in the moment. Then you've got a chance of doing something about it. So it's not something you can learn by going to a training course and having a PowerPoint presentation on it. That would only really give you the basis of it. What you've got to do is to start understanding yourself.
And not a lot of places take time to do that, do they?
No.
In my cybersecurity training, I've not had many people turn around and say, start being reflective about your triggers and things like that, which is a shame.
But I think it doesn't, you see, this is the big thing. I remember somebody saying to me, one of the modules around, I haven't got time for this. Well, you have. And it's because you're thinking about it as an extra thing you've got to do. But when you're on your journey home from work and something's happened, you just mull it over in your mind and you often think, oh, I should have said this or I should have said that. Yeah, it would have been much better if I'd have done X, Y, or Z. That's the reflection thing. You're actually doing it. We're all doing it. So it's becoming a little bit more aware of the psychology behind it. So when you're doing that reflection that you do anyway, you can be a little bit more structured about it and start to learn from it properly. It's not about sitting and writing a diary. We used to do it at Cranfield with the Cyber Masters programme. We used to get them to write a reflective diary, and the thinking behind it was right, but they was treating it as homework, and that kind of counteracted the benefit of doing it. So I think it's about making it very simple. The journal that I give out is a list of questions just to ask yourself. You don't have to sit down with that journal and fill it all out for half an hour after every incident, but the more that you're just running through those questions in your head, the more you're learning about yourself.
I guess to be framing it, but this is an actual self-improvement, not a test you have to pass.
Yeah.
I guess kind of alluded to this as we talked about, people getting tunnel vision, and this is very common in all kinds of situations where you're in some kind of competition or some kind of there's a pressure. And obviously, you mentioned there, this kind of emotional regulation can help prevent tunnel vision. Are there any other things that help people in crises to improvise well rather than freezing or just sticking to procedure?
I mean, there's so many different things, and they work on lots of different perspectives, really. So I think there's the physiological perspective. So you've heard about mindfulness and breathing. Wim Hof with his funny breathing methods, absolutely classic, and they work a treat. So that is the physiological way of bringing your emotions down. Then there's cognitive ways of looking at it. So people who've done any sort of cognitive behavioural therapy or who have anxiety will probably be familiar with these, and it's about actually realigning your thinking, reframing things more positively, red teaming yourself and your own thinking to a certain extent. And then there's the behavioural aspects to it, or how do I behave, recognising those behaviours and thinking, right, okay, now I need to take a step back and probably just leave the room for 10 minutes. That's something that I hear quite a lot from cybersecurity teams, is that they recognise recognise the benefit of actually saying, right, okay, it's all too much, my head's buzzing, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to nip outside and I'm going to walk around the block for 10 minutes and I'm going to come back. Or I go and make a cup of coffee, or I go to the bathroom, lock myself in a stall and do my deep breathing exercises for 5 minutes. So I think people realise that actually just walking away can be enough of a reset.
And it's something I imagine people don't allow themselves to do during a crisis situation.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken before about cognitive biases, and one of the biggest biases that you have, and I say biases, it's not a great word really, because we all have a knowledge of what bias means. It's a bad thing, it's something we do wrong, but in psychology, a bias is just an almost like a preference, a thing that we do automatically. And one of them is an action bias, and particularly when we're under pressure, we're under threat, it's like there's a problem, I need to jump in and start solving it. So actually, we're naturally pushed to action. So that is what makes walking away and stepping out that little bit harder, because we think if we're not here working on it, pushing through, trying to find a solution, then it's only going to get worse. But actually, that in itself can be the thing that makes it worse.
The paper says in its conclusion that the failure of the two leadership styles in Chernobyl and Fukushima was hindered because of cultural and institutional rigidities, particularly because it's the anniversary of Chernobyl. It's well known that the Soviets didn't tolerate mistakes and that they would hide things and things like that. When it comes to that idea of leadership that encourages hiding things, encourages a lack of transparency, what do you think that does to the people underneath the subordinates? Like, is there a way to tackle this? Is there a way that maybe people higher up in the leadership structure can say, actually, this is not what we need to do?
Yeah, it's very much going back to the human factors. It's very much a safety culture thing, and I think I do see this talked about quite a lot in cybersecurity. In aviation, they've been at this for quite a long time, and they have what they call a just culture. So that means that it's okay to make mistakes. We report on them, we're open about them, but also you have to be clear to people that they're not going to suffer any negative consequences of reporting a mistake they've made. So if somebody makes a mistake, you're not going to sack them or discipline them or anything like that. You've got to thank them for it. What can we learn from it and what can we put right? And then to actually go and put it right. Psychological safety is another phrase for that sort of culture, whereby it is very collegiate. It's about learning. And I think, Leanne, we've had this conversation before about making errors is a bad thing. Well, actually, it's not, because the errors are the things that you learn from that therefore improve you. It's actually a very good thing, because that's what you learn from. You don't learn from the things that you're already doing very well. The thing with psychological safety is I think it might have a reputation for being a little bit on the pink and fluffy side, and we must all be nice to each other. And it kind of is that, but it's not, because a big part of psychological safety that's not often talked about is actually it's still about accountability. It doesn't mean that we sort of let people off the hook. People still have to be accountable for their decisions, their behaviour, their responses, all of that sort of thing. But if you've got a very, very open culture where people trust each other, then it's okay to say all that. If you have the culture that you were just describing there about we mustn't make errors, people will hide things, then you're never really truly going to know where the problems are in the systems that you've got. So I think it's a great culture to have. Is it an easy culture to get? No. Culture change, as you well know, takes years. It's not an immediate thing, and it has to be that the people at the top are modelling that behaviour. It's no good saying that, we're okay about this, and we don't mind you making mistakes, we want to learn from them, if you then go and counteract that by the way that you act. So if somebody gets told off, for example, the words and the actions are not matching up. So it's about very much demonstrating that and being very open about it. So I think there's nothing quite so powerful as a leader that's humble and turns around and says, actually, I don't know about this. What do you think? Or I made a mistake. This is what happened. This is, how do you think we can work on this better and go next time? But I think there's that sort of old style leader thing, is that the leader must have all of the answers. And that's so not the top. That's just absolutely not a thing when you work in very complex environments. I mean, the paper mentioned complexity leadership, and there's actually been an awful lot of research done on that. I think the best example I've ever seen for it was when I was working with special forces, and how it was described to me. He was saying that under pressure, what they do is sort of flattening the hierarchy. So the leader's not there to make decisions. The leader's job is to facilitate all of the experts from across the team to come together to build the solution to move forward. I see that as being very relevant in cybersecurity because it's not all on one person, and you've got lots of different teams of people with different skills that need to come together, and they're all experts in their area. So let the experts work on the bits that they're expert in. I had a wonderful example from somebody a little while back, and I don't know exactly what the situation was. They're in the middle of a crisis, and there was somebody on the team who was a technical expert, but he'd been sent home because they've all been at this for days on end and everybody's tired. But there was nobody else who could do the job. And this person that I was talking to actually went to his house to babysit the kids because his wife was at work, so he could actually sit at home and do the technical job while the CISO was looking after his kids. That perfect example.
I don't know if it's just coincidence, but because as you were speaking there, before you even said about the flattening of the hierarchy, I thought, how far up does a hierarchy need to go? Like, how deep does a hierarchy need to be for it to become effectively a blocker to crisis, to dealing with the crisis well? And thinking about, actually, is it just coincidence that both of these disasters happen in highly hierarchical cultures? And if people were better able or more empowered to be autonomous, would the potentially be the outcome being different? I mean, it's difficult to say, I guess, because we don't have time machines.
Well, it is, but I think that it was the 80s, and I hate myself for saying that. Different times, things have moved on an awful lot since then, and I think there's a lot more acknowledgement that certainly, in the West, that we don't have that kind of culture anymore. I mean, military is a great example of this, and I've seen this in all of the research that I've done, because that's a very, very hierarchical thing. But some of the research that I've been doing over the past couple of years is looking at the next generation battlefield technology and how that can improve situational awareness on the battlefield. So instead of the order to fire coming down from the hierarchy through that chain, now you're giving the people who have the weapons are getting that level of situational awareness that they wouldn't normally have. And that obviously has been very different for the military to get their heads around, really, because what they train to do is for people to do what they're told, command and control, act in a certain way. Yet technology and the multitude of different threats that they have these days have meant that they're having to change. So it's about enabling those people to make decisions is one thing, and giving, empowering them to do that. However, you've got to think about the people on the receiving end of that empowerment, because if they're used to a very hierarchical way of working, are they going to be comfortable with all of a sudden having to take on a lot more responsibility? So it's about giving them the boundaries of decision making so they know what their arc is, if you like, to use a military term, and they can make decisions within that. And if they make the wrong decision, then again, it has to be that just culture, that psychological safety, so they can actually be confident that even if they do make the wrong decision, that at least we can learn from it. And I think that gets more difficult when you see, it was quite a number of years ago now, about the Marines who'd shot people on the battlefield, and now 15 years later were being taken to court because of the decisions they made under those circumstances. It's a really difficult thing to achieve, but there are ways of going about it. And again, it's about not working it out in the middle of an instant. It's about being prepared.
When it comes to that decision making, though, as in the case of the Chernobyl incident, sometimes leaders downplay the risks, and that causes them to delay actions. Why do leaders do that, even when the risk seems obvious, do you think?
Because lots of different reasons. The risk is not necessarily obvious. I think what I do see, especially in hierarchical organisations, is that everybody tells the next level up the best scenario. So by the time it gets to the top, does the leader ever really appreciate truly what the risk is? If it's come up through several ranks and there's been a little bit of fluffing on the story at each level, how far removed are they from that front line, if you like? Do they actually understand that? The other thing is, it's an interesting one, this goes back to the emotional regulation thing, is sort of levels of confidence, because confidence changes under pressure. So some people will become very overconfident and sort of start barking out orders, and others will freeze. So actually they're not making a decision because they don't know what to do. So it's a combination of lots of different things. And obviously then you've also got your individual appetite for risk. Some people are very risk averse and some people will go completely the opposite way. So there's a whole load of factors in this sort of the mess of what's going on, if you like, that makes it very difficult to actually understand why people do what they do. But it does make it very easy for us to say, well, actually, why didn't you do that? And then it goes back to yet another bias, the bias of hindsight. It's very easy for us to see with all of the facts that we have have, and looking at it from a very calm outward perspective to being in it in that moment. It's a very different thing. So it's not always very easy to say in that moment exactly what's going on.
Moving back to the paper for a second, I think it does describe different leadership styles or different types of leadership. And I thought it was an interesting read, and it talks about 3 different styles: structured, transformational, and adaptive. In a real crisis, do people tend to switch between these, or they default to one? How have you found that in the past with people?
People aren't consciously switching styles because you've got that narrowing going on. You're not even thinking about that. They fall back on what's familiar. So it'd be what they've practiced, what the organisation reinforces, what's their natural way of doing things, what the environment allows. So if the system, like with Chernobyl, is built around structure and control, that's what's going to show up. If it's built for adaptation, like with the special forces, you're more likely to see that, but it has to be there already. It's never going to change in that moment. People are very much defaulting to what they feel is necessary at the time. Yeah, what's automatic, and that goes mostly back to the old command and control thing. So I think it was an interesting exercise that they did. I think it was interesting they tried, what was it, transactional, transformation and complexity. And I think what I wasn't quite sure of from the paper when I looked at the methodology was how did they match up the leadership styles with the reports that they were reading. But yeah, it was an interesting way of doing it, but I was a little bit disappointed because I think there's so much work being done on complexity leadership. Having just written some training on leadership and complexity for the UK MOD last summer, I'm very aware that there's an awful lot of research out there. So it was a little bit disappointing to me that they kind of chose to go with older research than really what's going on at the moment.
Well, we're lucky to have you as the expert here. So tell us more about complexity leadership.
Yeah, I think key to it all, I think, is probably adaptability. So the research that I did, so it's not about which is best. Is it transactional? Is it transformation? Is it complexity leadership per se? It's about knowing what to apply and when, because you're going to go through lots of different circumstances and scenarios and contexts that are going to require something different. There's a great piece written by a guy called Keith Grint, who used to work at Cranfield, and he did a lot of research into the VUCA environments, that's volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And what he saw that there were 3 different leadership styles there, but there's command and control. So if the situation is, the building's on fire, we need to get out, then it is very much command and control and out you go. If you've got sort of everyday general leadership and management things, then that's sort of fairly middle of the range, so you can use a different, probably more transactional style. But if you've got very complex situations, which is exactly what the cyber threat is, then it is about transferring very much to that sort of more complexity style of leadership, which isn't the leader is the leader, it's the leader facilitates a group of experts coming together. So it's about recognising, I think, really what situation you're in, what's needed, and being able to adapt in terms of your thinking and your behaviour to the context of the situation that you find yourself in.
No, I love that.
No, I think adaptability is actually the key thing, because it's about adaptive thinking, about adapting your behaviour, it's about adapting your leadership style. So I think, yeah, the key word is adaptable.
So the paper suggests that strict adherence to procedures actually made things worse in the case of Chernobyl. And also the Fukushima disaster as well. The kind of flip side of the Fukushima disaster was that they put a lot of stock into how safe their plants were, and that caused them to delay their actions. When does having good procedures help, and when does it become dangerous or even a hindrance?
I think that a procedure is very good as long as the scenario behaves and does what the procedure says it will. You think about airlines that use checklists before takeoff, so that's kind of nice, because the pilots checked all the buttons are switched to the right settings and that before the plane actually gets airborne. And I think that sort of thing is great, but it's back to adaptability, because you have certain procedures that you have to follow, and that's great. And as I said right at the start of the chat, you can actually use those to calm yourself down because you've got something to hang on to help build your confidence. But it's also knowing when to recognise that the situation isn't playing out in a way that the procedure can cope with. And I think that when we're struggling and we don't know what's going on, we cling to things for that stability and security. And I think procedures can become your safety blanket. But if you don't understand that what the safety blanket is doing doesn't match the scenario you've got, then that's where the problems come in. So it's about being able to understand that actually this isn't working, this procedure. And instead of just doing it more to make it work, why isn't it working? Is it because the situation you found yourself in isn't accounted for by a procedure? and there's a multitude of things that can happen. I guess it's like with threats, you can't train for every threat, but you can train for any threat by training that cognitive readiness and that adaptability.
Based on what you know, and obviously you mentioned that the world is a very different place since the 80s. It's a very different place since certainly since Chernobyl. It's even changed since Fukushima. Do you think modern organisations are actually better prepared than they used to be, or is it just more complexity thrown on top of it all?
Both, just to be really awkward and not get off the fence. Yeah, I think we are. I think the biggest thing for me when I think back, because I've been doing this since 2003, you've only got to look at the amount of technology, the leaps and bounds that have been made in the last 20 years with technology. We're much more global organisations now. Everything's interconnected. So I think that the complexity has definitely, it's just crazy really, the level of complexity. But also I think that people are now more aware. And I think for me, the biggest change or sea change came with the pandemic. So whilst it was absolutely awful, we've learned an awful lot from that, because I think that was a true VUCA environment, and people now understand what it needs to be adaptable because they've lived through it. So I think that whilst it wasn't great, it was great in some respects, because the consequences of that have made us understand that actually we do need to be flexible, we do need to be adaptable. We understand what that looks like now because we've been through it, and the organisations that I've seen that have come out of that in a really good way are the ones who haven't gone back to the way that we've always done things. They've taken those lessons learned and actually run with it. A really good example of this I've seen, I don't talk about what I do outside of my day job, but I'm actually a magistrate, so I work within the Department of Justice, and I started just as the pandemic hit. But what I've seen is that the way that the court's run has been much improved because we had no choice but to do it through the pandemic. But before that, there was very much a mindset of this, it has to be very formal in the way that we do things. Whereas now I see you don't have prisoners coming in vans from the prisons just to come into court for a hearing. It's all done by video link now. And that it's just wonderful to see how much more efficient they've become. I'm not saying they're truly efficient, but there has been a lot of changes because of that from organisations that perhaps weren't that open-minded before the pandemic. So I think it really has helped us understand this need to adapt and be more flexible in the way we do things and to challenge our thinking about the way we do things, because there's no way, like I say, the Ministry of Justice would have moved in that way had the pandemic not happened. And I think that's true for an awful lot of organisations. And I can think of a couple of organisations that I know that have actually become very aware of things like burnout and stress and pressure, and understand that the cyber teams are constantly under pressure, and they're starting to now look at how we train people and how we educate people to deal with that level of pressure. Somebody described it to me not so long ago as, if you think about it, like the police, fire service, ambulance, military, all deal with constant pressure in their worlds, and they all have training and support around that. Yet you've got cybersecurity professionals who also deal with a huge amount of pressure, and it's not just over a couple of days, it's over months. And yet there's a big gap there. They're expected just to cope. So it's kind of nice to see things moving towards being more cognizant of the fact that actually people don't always perform well under pressure, but they can.
I guess another element of that kind of complexity is the fact how easy it is to engage with other departments outside of your own bubble. So, for example, in the case if there was a nuclear cyber attack incident on a power plant somewhere, it wouldn't just be the remit of that nuclear power plant. The nuclear power plant would have to speak to other areas of public infrastructure and get other people involved. How does the need to engage with people outside of your own bubble, because you might have a perfect, well-oiled machine, your team has practiced cybersecurity incidents, but oh no, there is the unknown element of the outsider that you also need to inform and keep on top of things. How does that change that dynamic in terms of complexity? And do you have any recommendations of how people in cybersecurity teams need to engage with outside entities when an incident is happening?
There's the regulatory side of things, and I think that that's sort of fairly well dealt with because people understand when they need to call the regulator in. And I think people that build relationships with regulators and have conversations about what could happen and how they might deal with it and treat them as a friend, not the enemy sort of thing, will find that side of it can be quite easily dealt with. I think the bigger thing that is of interest is bearing in mind that the whole thing that CISOs have to live in culture-wise is that maybe the board doesn't understand, is my job under threat? I've got to be seen to be doing the right thing. I need to display confidence to enable the team to move forward. What I have seen in cybersecurity, and it's super impressive, is that there is actually communities of CISOs who I know would ring each other up and say, something really crap's happening. I don't know what to do. Help me out here. And they have this wonderful community that will gather around and put their arms around them when they're having a bad time, sort of thing. So I think it's not just about the formal way of doing things and building relationships. I think there's a lot of very informal, very close networks, because they need people they can trust, who understand the experience they're going through, and who might not necessarily be able to solve it, but who can support them. And that's very much a resilience thing. So I won't name the communities that I'm aware of, but it is super impressive when you see them in action. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that. And that's something that happens in aviation on a probably a bit more formal level, because there is a group of airlines who all get together and they might compete on routes and they might compete for customers. But when it comes to safety, they share information. And it's very much a similar sort of thing that is very well known about in aviation. I think in cybersecurity, it tends to be more informal with different groups that you can join. But with aviation, they've actually said, right, okay, we know that we're competitors, but we also know about the benefits of being able to share what worked for us, what didn't work. And there's actually a way of doing that. It might be interesting to see if the NCSC or somebody like that were able to do that sort of thing to enable that level of learning.
It's been a fascinating discussion. I guess the big question I'd like to ask you, and this is very lofty, but if you were redesigning a crisis leadership, maybe a course or something like that, for a nuclear power plant using things like behavioural science and psychology, what would you change first? What would that include? What would that look like?
I go back to the thing that I said about quite at the top, is that it's all very looking at different types of leadership, culture programs and all of that sort of thing. But it's exactly the thing that I'm doing anyway, which is let's look at what goes wrong when people are under pressure, because that changes. So all of the leadership styles, the decision-making models that you've been trained in, all of that sort of thing can just go out the window if you don't know what's happening to you when you're working under pressure. And that's sort of, having seen it in military and done a lot of research on it over the last 10 years or so, that's why I'm doing this Cognitive Readiness IQ program, because I found a way of measuring what the capabilities are, so you know across the team who's good at what and who needs support with different types of capability. And then obviously the whole program itself about recognizing yourself, understanding what your emotional heat map is, how you go about decision making, how your decision making changes under pressure, the relationships that you build, which is all about building trust and reducing friction, and then how to do that reflection piece. So it's just a constant learning stream. And to me, that underpins and makes the leadership training that you've had probably actually work a lot better, because you're managing the people side of things that we don't normally talk about.
Well, you heard it here first.
You heard it here first.
So such a course already exists. So, Bec, if people want to get in touch with you, how do they do so?
You'll find me on LinkedIn, or you can go to my website, which is www.mindscienceltd.co.uk, and that explains a whole lot more about all the things that I've talked about there. I'm also looking for people to take part in the pilot of this new program, because we've got to do some testing. So if anybody would be interested in that, then contact me via LinkedIn or via the website and we can have a chat.
And we'll put all those details in the show notes. But what an offer, listeners. So do take her up on that. It sounds fantastic. Get out your comfort zone a little bit. Go and test yourself in this pilot. You might be surprised at what you might find.
We've got a diagnostic tool that's also being validated. So even if you just wanted to have a go and sort of find out what your team structure looks like, that we'd really welcome. On data.
Exactly. Data feeds a big machine. So
yeah.
I definitely encourage our listeners to reach out to Bec. As I say, all in the show notes. Get involved. Feed the data.
Please.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today and illuminating us on the realities of crisis leadership.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been lovely to chat.
Oh, it's always so nice to have fan favourite Bec on. I'll put a link in the show notes to her past episodes. It's not the first time she's been on to discuss cybersecurity leadership, and do take her up on that offer as well. Jeff, what did you think of that discussion?
It's always a delight to have Bec on the show, and she's a friend of ours anyway. And it's interesting how, stripping it all back, although leadership failed, it fails for reasons that aren't leadership. We're people first. And unfortunately, we have emotional responses that can spell bad news for our actual response in time of crisis. So she notes that emotional regulation is one of the most critical upstream factors. You know, when you actually start to break down, almost literally, it degrades alignment between teams because you're no longer communicating effectively. And that cascades then into things like the leadership and the actual proper whole team communication. And that basically leads to poor decision making.
Really poor decision making. Isn't that to be expected, though? I mean, we don't always live on high alert in cybersecurity teams. You know, I'm not going to make any assumptions if you do work in a nuclear power plant as a member of the cybersecurity team. But if it's like other industries, you can go quite a long time with just the low-level day-to-day cybersecurity incidents. And by that I mean stuff that's not going to cause the world to catch fire in your industry. That whole thing about that preparedness piece is if you're not on high alert all the time, those skills will atrophy. And I think it's really interesting that it's something we can take through any industry. So obviously in a nuclear power plant, the consequences can be devastating, but as we said at the top of the episode, equally devastating in other industries as well. So I think these two discussions, one with Oleg helping us out understand what the real cyber threats are in nuclear power plants, but also Bec bringing it full circles, like, well, if you were working in these power plants, this is what you'd expect to see from a leadership perspective. Again, so many crossovers. I guess it doesn't really matter what industry you're in. The cybersecurity problem and the ways we have to deal with it all kind of boils down to the same thing, and that's having strong leadership, but also preparedness.
And as Bec pointed out, some of it you can't just learn it from a PowerPoint, and you can't tabletop it. You've got to think about other ways of how you prepare yourself, how you understand how you react in a crisis. Because, you know, she mentions one of her friends who said that he felt he was having an out-of-body experience when the incident happened, and he wasn't working a nuclear power plant. I agree, a lot of environments can be quite high stakes, and when the chips are down, it will probably feel like a nuclear accident to you. You know, if you're having an out-of-body experience, that suggests it feels very bad. And that means, you know, you could face further losses if you don't react appropriately. So I think this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion, and I hope people take a lot away from it, because I certainly have.
Me too. And I guess where it boils down to is that we're all the compromising positions in our organisation. And that is our show. Thank you again for joining us for a new episode of Compromising Positions, where we always ask, are we the compromising position here? Because we look at security from lots of different angles and how we all fit into this ever-changing, ever-scary, threatening world through the lens of cybersecurity and AI. So wherever you're joining us, wherever you're listening, do leave us a review, a comment, a like, a subscribe, a share, all that lot. It really does help us appease the algorithm gods. It helps us bring this show to a completely different audience and makes it absolutely free to you. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time. Keep safe, keep secure, and remember to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?